Hey there, we are back by popular demand. We're doing another lens shootout. I previously did a lens shootout between the 28-70 2.0 and the 85mm to see which was best. If you needed both, turns out, in my opinion, you do. But what we're doing today, we're taking 4 lenses that I use to shoot weddings and we're deciding, could you use them for portraits? Could all of these really be used as portrait lenses? So we're gonna test it out and let you know what we find out. Basically what's going on here is that we're trying to determine, technically, yes, all of these, you could take a picture of a human and call it a portrait. That's gonna work. But what we're gonna do today is break down the pros and cons of using these different lenses as a portrait lens to decide what is gonna be the best use of the lens, and can you get away with not purchasing some of them and using them for multiple uses? We're gonna test it out and let you know what we figure out. This would be a great place for me to give my very common disclaimer that I am not a tech guru. And if you've been here for any length of time, you know that about me. I don't like the techie side. I know how to shoot, I love to shoot, but if you're looking for like an in-depth gear review versus practical application, not going into the depths of every single mechanical part of these things, you need to look elsewhere. This is not your channel. So I am not going into the depths of the tech specs of these things, but I am going to be shooting with them and I am going to break down what it feels like and what I think is possible if I were to make decisions about what I would consider for portraits. I'm going to break all that down once we go outside. All right, so let's just break down the characteristics of some of these lenses in case you're new here and you've never heard me talk about things like my beloved 85mm lens. I love this lens. It goes down to 1.2. The bokeh is incredible. It's incredibly sharp. It's also very heavy and it's also very expensive and it's not super versatile, but what it creates is pure magic. And so I will always have this. Even if I retire one day, I will keep this lens. So ultimately, this is kind of like the control of our experiment because this is my go-to. If I want epic portraits and I have the space, this is my go-to lens. Like, it's my favorite. So everything is kind of being compared to, like, do you really need this fancy high-end lens? Or could we get some similar looks with longer focal lengths in other ways? Because these lenses can serve some other purposes that the 85 cannot. All right, so let's break down the 100mm macro lens. The reason why this is even considered in this lineup, it's not because I think, oh, it's a great portrait lens, but because there's possibility that it could be used for portraits. And a lot of photographers, when they're getting started, this is one of the first lenses you purchase because as a wedding photographer, there's no way to get that really great detailed macro shot without this lens. I know there's some adapters. I know there's some ways to do some workarounds, but really the best way to make sure you have those amazing detail shots and the best investment, in my opinion, is to have this lens. So I want to dive into testing, could this lens be used for portraits so that wedding photographers don't feel like I'm only investing in this lens for ring shots? I want to see if there's more to this lens. All right, so now let's talk about the 135 2.0. Interesting thing about this lens, it's the cheapest one out of this whole lineup. It's also the only EF lens in this whole lineup, but eventually they will probably have an RF version. It goes down to 2.0, it's a prime. So I love to use this lens most in dark ceremony situations because this is going to give me more focal length, it's going to give me a longer distance, but it only goes down to 2.8 and it is not a prime, and so this lets in so much more light and gives me a longer focal length, and it's very light. It's honestly probably the lightest one in the lineup. And so I've never really used it for portraits, but could it be used for portraits? It's kind of a similar situation to this guy, because would you purchase this just for low light ceremony options where you want to be closer, but you want more light to come in and you want something less heavy than this and that goes down to 2.0? For some people, they can't justify, even though it's pretty affordable, they can't justify purchasing it just for that small window of opportunities that you may or may not have every single season. So if we could do portraits with the 135 that are somewhat comparable to the 85mm, maybe that gives you more reason to invest. And it's not just for those one-off times at dark ceremonies. So what I'm really trying to decide specifically with this one is it's a longer focal length. So what does the longer focal length, how does that compare to not as long of a focal length with the 85, but this could be 2.0, this can be 2.0. Does that longer focal length with the 135 make a big difference? And if it does, what does that difference look like? We're gonna dive into all this, but that's what I'm thinking about this guy in my head. All right, last but not least, let's talk about the 70 to 200 2.8. This is the RF version. I actually like the RF version better than the EF version. I did a whole video about this. This lens, I think a lot of people would compare it to, like, do I need this guy and this guy? All right. Traditionally, wedding photographers would view this as the ultimate portrait lens, right? Because you have versatility, you have great distance, focal length is longer for the ceremonies. So I kind of feel like this is one of the greatest contenders of like, people are deciding between these two. Maybe not so much until they have more of the rest of their gear lineup set. Like this is somewhat a specialty lens for some people, but these two are very comparable in a lot of ways. But in my opinion, the prime versus zoom is a big change for me. It's very different, and I just can't ever see myself using what I use this lens for to be completely replaced with this. Some people love it. Every time I post about this lens, I get people saying, why would you not just use a 70 to 200? And I'm hoping today that I can show you, from my perspective, show you why I feel like they are so different and why I choose this over and over again. Okay, so this lens also kind of fits into the category of like, it's a utility lens. It's a lens that you have to have. People will say, oh, you're getting into weddings, you have to have this lens, because there's so many other purposes really in like the ceremony realm that you need to have it. Kind of like this guy, like you got to be able to shoot details. So you got to have this lens. So I'm hoping that in this episode, we can kind of determine, could this be used for more uses than just longer focal length for the ceremony or during toast or things like that? Could it be used and be somewhat comparable to like the 85 for higher compression portraits, like longer focal length portraits? We're gonna see. So really the question is there a big enough difference to justify owning both this lens and this lens? Can you tell a big enough difference to make that big investment to own both? We're gonna dive into that as well. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go outside and we're gonna shoot all of these at the same apertures. Then we're going to use the primes and shoot at a lower aperture because they're capable of that, and we want to have that to be able to compare to as well. So the reason we're doing this is because we want to see how the focal length affects the impact of like the compression with these images, and we don't want the variable of aperture to interfere with that. So we're going to do that first, and then we will show you the capabilities of these two with wider apertures separately. So then after we shoot, we're going to come back, look and compare and contrast them on the computer so you can see what the result is. Okay, so we're outside with my good friend Cameron, and we are basically 20-25 feet off of the background. So the trees in the background are removed from us a little bit. My goal with that is to be able to have some extra compression, because that's what we're measuring and that's what we're kind of comparing. So I am going to back up depending on which lens I'm testing out in order to consistently keep the same framing. So it's easy to compare, and we'll have a cleaner comparison side by side once we take these images in and put them on the computer. All right, so I'm going to start with the 85mm because it is the portrait lens that I love the most. I'm most comfortable with this lens, and so we're going to get started right now. Okay, so I'm going to start with an aperture at 2.8, so we have a baseline for all the lenses. All right, so this is 2.8, ISO 100. So now I'm going to shoot this same lens, same distance, same framing at 1.2 to kind of show off what it can do as far as compression and shooting wide open. My favorite. Beautiful. Beautiful, Cam. Perfect. So now we're going to switch to the 100mm macro. I can go a little closer. Beautiful. A couple more. I don't even have to tell you what to do. So I'm not that much further back, maybe like 3 to 4 feet. But if you think about it, it really shouldn't be that far back because it's 100mm versus 85mm. So this isn't far at all. It's fascinating because it does look very similar. So I'm interested to see how different the compression will look and the clarity will look kind of on the computer screen. But it just feels like a lighter version of the 85. I know it's different, but that's what it feels like right now. So we're not going to shoot this any lower, obviously, than 2.8 because it only goes down to 2.8. So now we're going to move on to the 135, which I'm actually really excited about because it is, I think, most comparable to the 85 in a lot of ways. So this one does have an adapter because it is the only EF lens that we are working with today. Okay, so she's looking right here at me, beautiful. Now, if I want to really get the exact framing, I am going to back up just a little bit. Smile at me again, beautiful. Perfect. Okay, now I'm going to shoot at 2.0. All right, that's as low as this lens will go as far as aperture is concerned. Perfect. Okay. It's fascinating. I assumed that I would be backing up a lot further, that it would feel a lot further with the 85, but really we're talking like 3 to 6 feet max. Moving on. 70 to 200. The holy grail wedding photography.
I mean, not in my eyes, but.
So this is at 85 at 2.8. It's funny, my shutter's got to be the lowest it's been. Perfect. So now we're going to do it at 200 millimeters, but I'm going to keep the same framing. So I'm going to back up just a little bit.
Woo! I'm going to back up a lot.
Wow. Yeah, this is definitely different. Okay, so staying just like this. Beautiful. Wow. That was definitely the biggest change. Okay, so we did that. This is what my key takeaways initially are. They all kind of felt more similar than I thought they would. The biggest, I think, differentiating factor without looking at these images on the screen is the weight, honestly. The 7200 and the 85 millimeter, the weight is just drastically different than the 100 millimeter and the 135. So that's something that I noticed right off the bat. Weirdly, the first thing I noticed. I noticed the difference of really getting the maximum compression with the 70-200 requires me to be like halfway across a field, which I know is going to produce a beautiful image, but that's something to pay attention to. I miss, with the zoom lenses, I miss being able to go down to 2.0, sometimes even lower with the 85 millimeters. I'm a girl that loves wide open, so for me, 2.0 just seems like that seems like the minimum, like a starting place. Like if I can go to 2.0, I'll be good for portraits. Going lower with the 85 is great, but not necessarily like a must-have. So yeah, I think I'm just interested to see what the final images look like, because it's honestly, even though I can see somewhat of the final image through the screen or through my viewfinder, I think it's going to be very telling when I see the final product and I can flip through them at the same frame, same aperture, and compare that way. As far as distance, the different distance I had to like go in order to get the compression that I wanted, I'd say I didn't feel disconnected from her until I was like, the 135 felt really far, but the 70-200 at 200 felt like I was so far from her. It was like almost like I was photographing something candidly. It didn't feel like I was a part of like photographing her personally. I don't know if that makes sense, but I felt really far away. And so if you're using the 70-200 for the sake of getting that high compression to compete with like the 85 millimeter, you have to recognize just how far away you're going to be. The 85 millimeter, I have to stand far back, especially for full body shots, but I'm never too far away to where I don't feel like I can connect with my clients. And if I am like doing this big wide shot with the 85 and I'm like half a field away, I'm going to tell them that beforehand. So I don't know, the 70-200 just felt like it was that kind of dynamic, but it was exaggerated. And I don't know if I like that. That might be the reason why I never choose this lens on a wedding day for portraits, ever. So yeah, that was something distance-wise, I didn't notice it being a problem until I got to the 70-200. Okay, so that's about all I can basically say out here without looking at the images. So we're gonna go inside, put them on the computer so we can really compare the compression, the bokeh, and look at what the framing, how that changes. So we're gonna go in, dive into that part, and then we can really analyze a full comparison.
So this is, pay attention to the background. The 135 millimeter 2.0 produces, even though I'm a little tighter on that shot, it's just slightly tighter. I think it produces more of the blur and that really beautiful bokeh. It's fascinating to me though. I look at this and I'm like, I'm not being drawn to the 85 millimeter like I thought I would. So let's break this down though, because remember, these are all shot at 2.8. And so that's keeping a control the same over every single photo. But now we have to really utilize the fact that the 85 millimeter can go the distance. It can do more than 2.8. So if you're watching this video because you're trying to decide, like, if I want that high compression look, which lenses do I have to have? And if I'm a wedding photographer, like, could I get the macro lens and get this kind of look? Well, obviously right here, you definitely could. Could I get the 135 2.0 and be able to shoot long focal lengths during ceremonies and have that prime lens look, but also get like an 85 millimeter look? Sure, you could. If you are happy with this level of bokeh, shooting at 2.8, then technically, I think looking at these, you could say, I don't have to spend money on the not so versatile 85 millimeter. I want to be a wedding photographer. I could actually get the 135 and have a longer focal length lens. I could do the 70-200 and have a great portrait lens. I could even do the macro lens as a portrait lens if I don't have the money to do a macro lens and a longer focal length lens for portraits. Now, this is where I'm going to make you frustrated because I'm going to show you the 85 millimeter at 1.2 versus 2.8. All right, so when you look at this, what we're comparing is the 70-200 2.8. It can only go down to 2.8, and we are framed very closely the same. All right, so it's a tight frame, it's a tight crop, and we're comparing it to the 85 millimeter 1.2 shot at 1.2. So you can look at the difference here. You can see the difference between 1.2 and 2.8. If you look at this and you think, oh, I don't care about that, like it's very minimal, you would be right. It is minimal. But I look at the 1.2 and I think that's why I love that lens. Because if I need to hide shopping carts in the background or like street signs in the background, I can shoot at 1.2 with an 85 millimeter and literally hide almost anything in the background behind my subjects. And I love that about the 85 millimeter. Let's compare this again to another lens. So we're going to compare the 85 millimeter 1.2 to the 135. All right, so now we're looking at the 135 2.0. So the 135, you cannot go lower than 2.0. We're cropped very similarly. 85 1.2 is the same as it was in the last slide. This is fascinating to me because I think these two look really comparable, which is good news for anybody wanting to do wedding photography that needs a longer focal length lens but wants the look of an 85 but can't afford both. I think what this shows you is that you can get a very similar look to 1.2 shooting a tight crop with a 135 at 2.0. So what does that mean for someone trying to make lens decisions? It means that if you are trying to build your lens collection as a wedding photographer, I would recommend getting a 135 2.0 for that longer focal length. You'll be able to use that in dark churches. You can still shoot close in dark churches where you can't use flash. And you have the advantages of letting more light in because it's a prime. And you don't necessarily need to spend a fortune on the 85 millimeter 1.2, even if you want the look of that really intense bokeh, that creamy background, that high compression. When you're looking at this, like this is in the same spot. It's not the same aperture, but it's very close. And I think they're super comparable. I think they're very comparable in the depth of field. I think they're comparable in clarity. So do I think I would ever just get rid of my 85 millimeter and use the 135 2.0? No, because I love my 85. I love it, and it is way more versatile than the 135. However, if you're on a budget, the 135 2.0 would serve multiple purposes, and the 85 millimeter won't get you as close to the front of the ceremony as the 135 would. So the 135 also fascinating. It is not super expensive. So I do not believe, Ty can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that the 135 2.0 that there's an RF version yet. So that's the only downfall. If you've gone to mirrorless, you've switched over, I'm not sure if there's an RF version quite yet. But if there is one that comes out and it's still affordable, that would be a really great option for those of you who are mirrorless shooters. And when I compare this to like the 70-200 here, I think that overall, the 70-200 is still a great image, but it's fascinating. Look at the color difference. Right? I didn't change anything about color. These are straight out of camera. Look at that color difference when you get it. She looks a little more gray. The greens are stripped out a little bit of the color. I think I love the color and the vibrancy of the 135 a little bit more. So that's fascinating, right? That one looks a little bit desaturated and literally nothing changed except it's a different lens shot at 200 millimeter instead of using the 135 shot at 135, obviously. So crazy. I think overall, when I look at this, I think, all right, if I wanted to get the 85 millimeter look and I didn't want to spend the 85 millimeter price, and I also wanted to buy a lens that could give me some really great distance, some focal length distance, the 135 could serve you really well. Now, it would be tricky to use it for portraits. You'd have to have a lot of space to be able to back up. But what we've learned from this kind of shootout is that you can get an 85 millimeter look with the 135 at literally like half the price.
So I hope this was helpful. It was fun to kind of see the comparison between these lenses. I've never done this before. And so it really made me step back and think through, like, what do I really think about the need in this new season of technology? What is the need and what is the versatility? What can I get from each one of these lenses and how necessary are they? And so I feel like we figured a lot of that out today, and it was insightful to be able to see a comparison of the same subject, same place, same lighting, same aperture, and then compare the compression and the overall end result. So if you like this, if you enjoyed this, if this was helpful, we have a whole slew of other videos about the R6, me switching to mirrorless, about lens and gear and setup, being a wedding photographer. And so make sure you watch those, but also make sure you subscribe and comment so we can connect with you. I will see you next week. We create a new video every Thursday. I'll see you in 7 days. Bye.